All right, good afternoon, good morning. Welcome everyone to the Restore America's Estuaries webinar series. My name is Hillary Stevens. I am the Coastal Resilience Manager here at RAE, and I'd like to welcome you all to our February webinar. Today's topic is Eutrophic Estuaries and Racist Systems, a love story. And our speaker today is Dr. Tiara Moore. We are very pleased to have her. I'll be giving you a brief introduction to our organization and then hand the microphone over. Restore America's Estuaries is a national nonprofit located in Washington, D.C. We are an advocate and a convener for our member groups, which you see on a map here, located around the country. We serve these member groups and indeed all people working to protect and conserve their coastal resources. We have information about living shorelines and blue carbon programs. We have a toolkit to help you get started with a restoration program. Lots of other things available at our website, which you see here. That picture on the left is me, and on the right, you'll see Tiara Moore, who we are very, very happy to have today. We will be hearing about her research in biodiversity as well as her personal story. Dr. Moore is a postdoctoral scholar at the University of Washington and the Nature Conservancy, where she is using soil environmental DNA to develop a biodiversity census of Ellsworth Forest to compare species diversity across management and treatments over the past decade. Additionally, Dr. Moore is the founder of Awoke Space and the lead organizer of Black and Marine Science, which she will be talking more about. With that, I'm very happy to hand it over to you. We look forward to hearing.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Let me pull my screen up. We know how this goes. All righty. Thank you so much for.
So go right ahead.
All right. Thank you so much for that introduction. And here is my slides. All righty. Yeah, thank you so much for allowing me in your space today. I do want to start by acknowledging the stewardship of the Duwamish and Coast Salish people on whose land I reside. Like she said, my name is Dr. Tiara Moore, and the title of my talk is Eutrophic Estuaries and Racist Systems, a Love Story. And I really ask you today to listen, to honor my truth, to not judge or compare, but to truly open your heart to my story, because it definitely is a love story. So I like to begin all of my talks doing my favorite thing, talking about me, but to also just give you a bit of perspective on who I am. So I'm originally from Greenwood, South Carolina. If you're wondering where that accent is from, that's it. And so I went to Winthrop University pre-med. I thought I wanted to be a pediatrician, but I didn't realize I didn't like kids like that. So I had to change. And so I actually ended up taking a tropical ecology class only because there was a research experience in Costa Rica. So I thought, oh, free trip. But then I got there and we were doing on a boat, and we were doing experiments and collecting water samples. And I found out, like, wow, this is a real career. And so I changed my whole path. So I came back from that experience, decided to go to a historically Black college university, Hampton University. And that's where I became a marine scientist. I started my research in the Chesapeake Bay and really started to understand water quality there. I then continued on and moved across the country to UCLA, where I continued working in the estuary, smaller estuary, and just trying to understand environmental impacts. And now I'm a postdoc at the Nature Conservancy and the University of Washington. I'm really trying to understand biodiversity and the restoration of an old growth forest. And throughout my career and my research, my focus has really been on humans and how they are impacting the environment, because we know humans are causing major environmental concerns. Things like destruction of habitat because of our increased population. There aren't enough buildings, apartments, Walmarts, Targets, things like that. So we destroy ecosystems in order to rebuild. Things like overharvesting and overfishing. We are fishing down entire ecosystems, causing displacement and disruption in these ecosystems because we're fishing at unsustainable rates. And now I'm not saying everyone needs to be a vegetarian or vegan, but we need to figure out ways to do these things more sustainably because this loss of habitat and overfishing leads to a loss of biodiversity. So these organisms are displaced, they lose their habitat, they have nowhere to go. And so we see changes in this ecosystem structure. Another major human impact to the environment is nutrient enrichment. Our agricultural practices put a lot of fertilizers on these different crops. And then when a rain event happens, a water event happens, all of those excess nutrients are washed into our waterways and our waters. And we see these enriched waters that can have algal blooms. And so in the Chesapeake Bay, in larger estuaries, we can see phytoplankton blooms. We also can have macroalgal blooms as well. A big impact that we're seeing a lot and know a lot about and hearing more about today is climate change. Due to the amounts of greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide that are being input into the atmosphere from transportation, manufacturing, and things like that, we're seeing changes in our temperature in the atmosphere and subsequent changes in the ocean, like ocean acidification. Because all of that excess carbon dioxide is in the atmosphere, it's subsequently absorbed by the surface ocean. It has a chemical reaction and causes acidic conditions, a lower pH. And so here you're looking at an intact shell to the left, and then it's been exposed to pH conditions expected in 2050. And so here by the end, you'll see that the shell is basically dissolved. The organism no longer has that its home, its safety net. And so what's really interesting about these two phenomena, this eutrophication, these nutrient pollution and ocean acidification, is that this really cool paper came out when I was starting up and trying to figure out what research I wanted. And it was this idea of eutrophication driven acidification. And so basically we have this atmospheric input of carbon dioxide that can be absorbed by the surface ocean that I just explained, the regular acidification. But what we also know is that we have these algal blooms that are also in these waterways. And during the respiration of this bloom, we could potentially have an increase of carbon dioxide in the waterway, and then be a localized version of acidification. And so I thought this was really cool. Like, oh, wow, what? And so what was interesting though about this particular study is that they found this with phytoplankton. And like I mentioned, I was in Southern California where we have shallow estuaries and we have these larger macroalgal blooms. So I created this figure to really discuss like what I wanted to do for my work. So here's this eutrophication driven acidification. Here we have the land runoff with nutrients. Like I mentioned, those get into the waterway, the water body, and then we see this increase in a macroalgal bloom. So in this layer here, we would expect to see a consumption of oxygen and then, I'm sorry, production of oxygen and the consumption of carbon dioxide. But with this macroalgal bloom, the bloom doesn't stay there in the surface. It will eventually start to decompose and this organic matter will sink through the water column. And then this is where we would see the opposite of that photosynthesis that was going on in the surface layer, but now an increase in microbial respiration. And so the byproducts of microbial respiration would then be the consumption of oxygen and the production of carbon dioxide that could potentially lead to that acidification that I mentioned earlier. And then I have the sediment linked here as well. But I have the sediment here as well because in shallow estuaries, the water column and sediment are tightly linked. And so that decaying organic matter would get into the sediment as well. We could potentially see the increase in microbial respiration along with the increase in carbon dioxide and that acidification. And so that's what I spent my time going to research. here I am in the estuary in Southern California during a macroalgal bloom. And so I'm there with my pH meter and my materials. And what I went out to see was during these blooms, did we see a change in pH? And so what I did notice is that yes, when we had these blooms, specifically in the summer where there was more decomposition, that we did see this change in pH. So me as a marine ecologist, yay, sounds good. But I was speaking with someone and they said, and we're talking about it and thought, oh, it would be really interesting if we could actually identify the players causing this respiration, if we could understand the microbial community in this ecosystem. And so again, as a marine ecologist, I'm like, what? What is this? And so I learned about the wonderful, beautiful field of environmental DNA. And so environmental DNA is a tool that basically as organisms are moving through the environment, they are dropping skin, fur, leaves, pollen, all those different things that have genetic material. And I always explain this the same way if you watch crime shows, because everybody loves crime shows, is that we have a criminal that does something, they tap a window, and then the detectives come in, get their fingerprint, and is able to identify them using their DNA. And so that's what we can potentially do in the environment. So if we blow this GIF up here for the visual folks, we see this fish is swimming through the water, but it's also shedding DNA. So we could scoop up that water sample, extract the DNA from it, tag it with universal primers using metabarcoding, and then identify those species that are present in the ecosystem. So it's a way to go from an environmental sample to understanding just a bit more about what's going on in your community. And so I thought this was cool. So I said, let's do it. And so I did. And so what you're looking at here is this biodiversity census of my estuary. And so without knowing any taxonomy at all, just looking at colors, and we're looking at the relative abundance here, we see immediately the middle site had quite a different microbial community composition. And I'll also tell you that the middle site is where I was, where we saw the algal bloom, the macroalgal bloom, and where we also saw acidification. So I wanted to explore this more. What was the composition that was different of the middle site? So I was able to do this using this eDNA, not having that background in taxonomy, but being able to use Google and looking at the dominant species that were in the ecosystem. I was able to see that the microbes present were their function was driving decomposition and nitrification. So here we had the output of this decreased pH, and we also saw now the players in the ecosystem. And so this turned out to be a really interesting aspect to the research. And so when I think about this project, and here's where I get to the love story part. Because as scientists we think, oh wow, this is cool, and we present the research and we just keep it going. But when I talk about this project, I'm always brought back to my day in the field. And some folks, maybe if you follow me on Twitter, you may know this story, but this story, it always brings me pain, but I share it because I think honesty is best. So when I look at this photo, and it's almost a stock photo now because folks have used it so much, look at this Black girl in the field, in the mud, enjoying herself, and which I do because I love what I do. But during this particular field season, I was out collecting. And like I said, I have science equipment, I have different things going on. And as scientists, we know when we do research, we have to do some work to get permits. And so it was a very planned out event. But while I was doing that research, sitting there in the field, a white woman approached me and she said, "Hey, what are you doing there? You don't belong there. I'm going to call the police." And immediately I was fear struck. And as I've had this conversation with some other white colleagues, they say, "Oh, we get heckled all the time." folks say this to us all the time. People say things to us who think we don't belong all the time. And I think the point to understand and to really consider is what the police mean for different people. Because for me, now here I am sitting in a field of mud, which I love. But a white woman just told me she was going to call the police on me. And so now I am in a life or death situation because the police and Black people don't do too well. So I have to figure out what can I do in this situation to appease someone who is threatening me, so I don't end up as a name on this list. So I put my best code switch on, tell her, oh, I am a scientist at UCLA and I am doing research. I have a permit to be here. And her tune changed quite quickly. And she said, oh my gosh, you're a scientist. How can I help you? And in my head, the heart beating fast, thinking like, girl, you almost just got me killed. I said, oh, would you mind taking a picture of me in the field? And I smiled. Even though I sat there afraid for my life, I smiled. And now this photo is what's seen about my work. That, but not the backstory, not how it could have went left and I could have been a name on this list. And I think what's most important about this story is that this was before George Floyd. This was before people woke up and started thinking about lack of diversity and how the anti-Black culture has infiltrated every space in our history in our country. This is before organizations would invite people like me to give talks like this. And that's my reality, my truth. But I pressed on, I continued that trip and I collected my samples and I went back to my lab and I processed them. And so when I think about the lack of diversity in STEM in our field, it really makes me, it's like people are asking why. And I put these two clips up. So here's a post from a Nature article. No progress on diversity in 40 years. Ethnic and racial diversity are extremely low among United States citizens and permanent residents who earn doctorates in earth, atmospheric, and ocean sciences. Worse, there has been little to no improvement over the past 4 decades. At the same time, this article came out in 2018. I wrote a similar article about my experiences as the only Black person in the room, years before George Floyd, years before it was cool to talk about diversity and inclusion. And I talked about different experiences I had about when I introduced myself as a marine scientist, people ask me if I know how to swim. I talk about how I went on a scuba diving trip, how I trained so hard to become a scientific diver. But when I got there, folks asked me if I was only there to carry the tanks. So these stories and this history has been occurring, but now we're trying to figure out what we can do. And I think the biggest thing that we have to understand, history and the culture of why things look the way they do. Why do people see me as a Black person and assume I can't swim? And again, I think it's because we don't have a historical perspective. We try to erase slavery like it didn't exist. And I think we think so broadly about slavery like it was so many years ago. But I remember growing up hearing my grandma tell me this.
Don't you go in those woods, girl. Those white folks are hanging. Don't you go in those woods, girl. Those white folks are hanging. Don't you go in those woods, girl. Those white folks are hanging.
So that's the trauma that slavery has. Here's my grandma who raised me, who warned me, hey, the woods, this environment, it's not too safe for us. And so when we don't understand that perspective, we'll never change the outlook of the field. And then when I tell this story, people, oh, again, your grandma, maybe she was being too overprotective. But then I show this. And I think, again, without an understanding of historical perspectives, we don't see cultural realities. What you're looking at is a picture of my softball from my high school. So my name is Tiara Moore, my nickname, Timo. And I was the only Black girl on the softball team. And when we would go, and in South Carolina, you can imagine, and we would go to different places with definitely no diversity. And my teammates would say, hey, we'll protect you, but if you ever get in line, don't worry. We have our noose. And so this was a memory that they had for me. Hey, Timo, let me go get my noose. Just playing. Had a blast playing with you. So slavery and that whole perspective is intertwined in my reality and has been used against me. So we can say, oh, slavery was hundreds of years ago, but here is my softball. I graduated in 2007. And so when I think more about, again, understanding historical perspectives and cultural truths and realities, and I think specifically about our field, marine science, the water. And so since, again, there is this lack of understanding of how these traumas impact Black people in general, until we understand that, we won't see a change, because I have to ask you a real question. When we think about the Atlantic slave trade and the millions of my ancestors that are at the bottom of the ocean, why would I ever want to scuba dive? And when we think about the acid and the bleach that was poured in the pools of my grandparents to prevent them from ever learning how, why would we want to swim? And this is history that we graze over, that we say, oh, they're not interested or they don't want to be here. There is systemic racism and barriers that have been in place that has caused Black Americans to be less likely to know how to swim, because pools, they pour bleaches in pools. I remember my grandmother telling me this story, like, hey, we can't trust these pools. There might be bleach in them, there might be acid. So until we address and have a pure understanding of what's been going on, we'll see why marine science as it is isn't that diverse. And so when I say why, and when we talk about the history and why would we want to be here and why would we do this and why is this my love story when I know these truths, is that we're more impacted by environmental injustices. It is a fact that race is the #1 predictor of exposure to pollutants. People of color are much more likely than white Americans to live near polluting facilities. The result is overall people of color are exposed to as much as 63% more pollution than they produce, while white Americans are exposed to 17% less. So even knowing these things, we're impacted. And we're impacted by pollution that we're not even causing. And then also we know that we care about the planet. There are studies that show that there are Black and brown people who care and who are concerned about what's going on in the environment. So when I hear things about, oh, there's not an interest, or oh, there's not folks out there, that's not the case at all. It's about the barriers that are put in place over a decades of history, centuries really, that we have to address and we have to confront and be honest about and acknowledge. Because we see time and time again, even though we care about the planet, we're not allowed to exist on this planet. And y'all remember this story.
Please don't come close to me. Please don't come close to me. Please call the cops. Please call the cops. I'm going to tell them there's an African American man in my life. I'm sorry, I'm in Randall, and there's a man, African American, with a license on it. He's recording me and threatening me and my dog. There is an African American man. I am in Central Park. He's recording me and threatening myself and my dog.
So similar to me, out just trying to do my research, Christian Cooper was trying to bird. And we're both seen as a threat seen as a threat, like we're not supposed to belong. And I think as I've made my journey in being a scientist, I realized that before 2020, the lack of biodiversity didn't seem like it was changing. We saw that clip, there was no progress in 40 years. And so I got to the point, honestly, where I felt after, I graduated from Dr. Moore, and there were still things occurring, doors slammed in faces, people asking me if I was a janitor, if I belonged, if I should be there in these spaces. And I thought, wow, what can I do to change this? Because I feel like I'm solution oriented and I don't want to be drab this whole talk. And so I moved towards my activism. And the first thought that I had when I was experiencing a lot of the challenges that I've had is trying to understand why. And as intersectionality goes, I have to ask myself, is it because of racism or sexism? Is it because I'm a woman or is it because I'm Black? And usually it's both. And so I created a woke space, a space that is just trying to create safe spaces for women of color to simply exist. And so being the only Black person in spaces was rough when people don't feel like you belong there. And so what I did was created a virtual safe space for women of color to come together and have community. So we have weekly events and different things. So if you have women of color in your community that need a safe space, your organization, they're the only person there that has been looking for community, definitely check us out. We also have a blog where we write stories. We have women of color sharing their stories. A lot of what I heard last year was that people didn't know what was going on. They didn't realize this was happening. And so we have stories on our blog about the different struggles. Of course, we have merch, and we also offer ally training. Another thing that I saw with a lot of trainings, and I'll be honest, is that they're taught by older white men who haven't had the experiences of the oppression that we talk about, that we experience. So we've created these small trainings that help to show, hey, this is what's happening to women of color in this space. So definitely, if you're interested, please check out a woke space. Another large, movement I was involved with happened actually right after the Christian Cooper situation. after that incident with the black birder, other birders, black birders got together and created a movement, Black Birders Week, on social media. And I remember being so excited going on social media one day and just opening my phone and seeing just Black people outside birding. And it was really to dispel the myth that we don't belong outside. And so from there, other STEM weeks decided to have weeks, STEM fields decided to have weeks to really highlight the lack of diversity, but also the diversity that is there. And I think we can get caught up in that. And I try to stray away because I have been the only Black person in the room, but I'm still a Black person in the room. But anyway, from there, so I saw Black in Chem and Black in Physics. So I put out a tweet and said, hey, where is Black in Marine Science Week? And so we hosted Black and Marine Science Week last year, and it turned out to be a phenomenal event. Just for the first day during the BIMS roll call, we reached over 200 Black marine scientists that introduced themselves and said, hey, wow, I didn't know there was this many people in the field. And so it was just so exciting to see the reach that was possible, how I was no longer the only Black person in the room. But of course, after success, there is always something on the back end. And so shortly after Black and Marine Science Week, the NSF tables came out and about graduation tables, and this is for PhDs. And so what we're looking at is for field of study, ocean and marine sciences. And here are all the races of folks who graduated in 2019. And so when we look at the numbers, Black or African American, we had 4. And I am one of them. And so this was disappointing to see because, like, wow, we are seeing Black people are here, but we're not in the rooms, we're not getting the PhD. So what's going on there? And so after this came out, I talked with the organizers and we decided to continue doing work for Black and marine science, and that we really want to change the face of who people see as scientists by putting out content, by putting out science content to communicate to the world. And so we've developed our BIMS Bites series, and here's the trailer.
Welcome to BIMS TV. I'm Dr. Camille Gaines. I'm Leslie Townsend.
I am Alex Troutman.
I'm Dr. Jeanette Davis.
I'm Dr. Tiara Moore.
I'm Simone Bartley. And this is BIMS Bites. BIMS Bites is a weekly series featuring Black marine scientists presenting a small bite of marine science.
I'm biting into what is marine science.
I'll be biting into the water cycle.
I'll be biting into biodiversity.
I'll be biting into plastic pollution.
I'll be biting into climate change.
I will be biting into tidal marshes.
Make sure you tune in Fridays at 10 a.m. PST, 1 p.m. Eastern. We'll see you there. And so for folks that don't know, people, I won't say everybody, people love YouTube. And so we thought the goal behind that is to put content out, easily accessible content of what our research is. And hope like folks will find this on YouTube and see there are other folks who do science and talk about science. And then again, the whole goal is to create this community of people that exist actually in this field and are doing this work. And so the goal for Black marine science is to do just that. So as I think about my research in biodiversity, my advocacy in diversity, I think about it maybe simply. And at the end of the day, we are all DNA, a bunch of A's, G's, T's, C's that can be identified in a dirt sample. Who are we to tell people they don't belong? Who are we to not create spaces for other people to exist? We need everyone in this fight for justice, for climate justice, for ocean justice. And so the more time we spend keeping people out, the more time we're hurting the environment in the estuaries in the ocean that we claim that we love. How much more time could be spent on eutrophication if we weren't talking about and dealing with the impacts of racism? And I'm only saying that's the goal, because I'm not saying that we shouldn't be, because we have to, because we're here now. The only way we'll get out of it is to face it. And I think that's what we have to do. We have to understand that your DNA can be found in a soil, a dirt, a water sample. We all belong here. And we all have to make space for each of us to make an impact and a difference if we're truly going to fight climate change and ever see any type of environmental justice. So with that, thank you so much for listening. Here is my contact information. If you are, I'll pop this back up, but if you are looking for ways to support, these are the easiest things. For any of the things that I talked about, you can follow, like, subscribe, amplify, donate. We are doing a lot of content creation, boots on the ground work in my different organizations. And so supporting and amplifying that work it would be great. A lot of folks have, larger platforms, and they want us to, create new content and do things like that. And I'll be honest, some of the content isn't received well by your audiences because y'all didn't let them know the change. I think we can sometimes assume that everyone is on the same page. But I know that I've had made content for folks with large platforms and it gets 2 likes, because your audience isn't ready to make this change with you. So I've asked that y'all really think about the impacts and the changes that you're trying to make when you are in asking for minority communities to do more work. So I ask you first, look at the work that's being done. Go to Black and Marine Science, go to Awoke Space, retweet, subscribe, like, amplify, and then donate to support the efforts that we are doing. And with that, I'll take any questions. Thank y'all.
Thank you so much. This has really been eye-opening and powerful to listen to, and I want to thank you for sharing this with us. I'm really feeling the distance right now of having to do all this over Zoom. I think that this kind of really personal expression deserves eye contact, it deserves applause, it deserves being in the same space. So I really want to thank you on behalf of us here at Ray and of everyone who has had the honor of being here to listen to you today.